go. So welcome to the Canberra Atlassian community event. So I'm Jeff, community leader here with the Canberra Atlassian community. Today we have Kynan Hughes who will be presenting. So Kynan has returned to Canberra fairly recently after a long extended stay away for a couple of decades, maybe a bit more than a couple. And in any case, so Kynan, why don't you give us a bit of a rundown about yourself before we sort of kick on, and then I'll go through in regards to the chat and the hands up kind of stuff.
Sure. I'm an agile coach. Before I was a coach, I was a technical manager, software developer. I still like to code. And I'm very delivery focused. You might be able to tell that from this talk. This is a talk that I did at a presentation I've done in a couple of places. One of them was Canberra in Australia. It's actually a challenge for me to make it. So it's always a challenge for me to make this agnostic because I use Jira all the time in my work. I've been using it since it was a bug tracking system and didn't have a board, back in the day. So I'm going to let loose and talk about it, this concept in the context of Jira, which is going to be good. And I would love questions and also challenges if you want to stick your hand up and say, hey, that doesn't make sense. That'd be great.
Excellent. So I might just say, yeah, so if anyone's got questions throughout, please type in the chat, and that would be good. I know that there may be capabilities for people that we can add you as a presenter for a short period to ask a question as well. So if you'd like to do so, that's perfectly fine. The session is being recorded. We will make it available to other community members as well. So okay, Kynan, thank you. I'll be quiet except for when I get questions from others or have my own.
Great. You can jump in anytime you like. Okay, so this always has a different title. Today it's called Manage What You Can Control, Leveraging Outputs in Jira for Better Outcomes. So that's a funny word, outputs. It's almost like it's a bit dangerous to say it these days, but that's what I hope we'll explore and come to some agreements about during the course of this presentation. This is to orient us to where we're at with this talk. So when we start doing, like typically if I come into an organization, and I mean, if there's some agile coaches in an organization, generally what we're trying to get is more speed and predictability in delivery. Now it's not the end of the journey, right? As soon as we're fast enough and predictable enough, probably we want to focus on something else, like are we delivering the most value we can? Are we delighting our customers? That sort of thing. But usually the first thing we're trying to get, and maybe something we never get to, or at least not for a while, it takes a while to get as fast and predictable in our delivery as we want to be. That's the context for this whole talk. So I want to start off with a story which is called the lead time pilot. I don't know, lead times, people use terminology differently, but lead time, you could think of lead time as the time it takes you to finish something once you start it. Sometimes it gets called cycle time or flow time as well. So I had this idea a few years ago when I was working in a large organization, a financial organization. And I had the opportunity to work with one squad, focus on one squad. And in fact, I pitched to the department, let me do a pilot where we do nothing but focus on lead time. We focus on getting faster. And everything we do, stand-ups, retros, coming up with ideas for improvements, metrics, it's all around getting faster and more predictable with this delivery metric, this lead time metric. And I promised that what was going to happen was that during the course of the pilot, 12-week pilot. They were doing 2-week sprints. This squad was going to get twice as fast. So, you know, I kind of put myself on the line for that. And there was a lot of lead up. I had a lot of lead up. So I had time to work with this squad for quite a while, sort of about 8 weeks beforehand, to get them ready for the pilot. You know, what's lead time? What are we going to be doing? Get yourself structured. We did a lot of things to get ready for the pilot. When we started, we measured our lead time for things that got done during sprint 1, and that became our baseline, 100%. And then we did sprint 2, and our lead time more than doubled. And I thought, ooh, hang on a minute, it's not ideal, but I'm sure we'll get back on track. In sprint 3, came back down. I thought, okay, we're on a run. Sprint 4, it stayed exactly the same. Sprint 5 came down a little bit. Sprint 6 came back up again. And I thought, I didn't see the improvement. We didn't see the improvement. We weren't able to demonstrate the improvement that I thought would come from this experiment we were doing. But, you know, I saw all this stuff, great stuff going on in the team. They were retroing twice a week. They'd started doing automated testing. They were pushing back upstream to get more frequent deployments. They were reducing bottlenecks in like code reviews, all sorts of stuff. They were doing heaps of things and they loved it. At the end of the pilot, I said, do you want to stop? And they said, no, we want to keep going. But I was, you know, it was embarrassing that we didn't get the improvement, the measurable improvement that I expected and that I promised. And then the Scrum Master for the team actually went back and looked at the lead time for the previous 6 months and shared this graph with me. And what it shows is that for the previous 6 months, the lead time was all over the place. For quite a few sprints, nothing was delivered. And then when things were delivered, they were really long, unpredictable lead times. And so that, you know, the people who were waiting for these things that the squad was delivering were waiting a long time and being sort of confused about when nothing was being delivered. And so this was a huge change, but it didn't happen during the actual pilot. It happened sometime before we started. And so I started to untangle what was going on and what all the things we did. What was the thing that actually changed this squad? Like, turned them from a kind of unpredictable, slow squad in the eyes of their customers to a fast and predictable squad. And it turns out that this was the constraint that really activated the whole thing for the squad. I made sure that we only cared about team outputs. So all we were tracking and managing in Jira were end-to-end outputs for the team. And so that's what this presentation is about. And since then, this is the first thing I do whenever I go into any engagement, is I get this embedded, this constraint. We only care about end-to-end team outputs. That's all we have. That's all we manage in Jira. So what's a team output? It's hard to say. You have to make a judgment, but these are the kind of signs. Somebody's asked the team for it. It's worked on by multiple people in the team. It's not just one person's task in the team. It goes through a few hands. The team came up with it, for instance, in a retro. Or it's some kind of mandated thing. Everybody has to do this sprint. We all have to do this training, or this is something we have to do to, you know, manage. This is part of our risk management, something like that. Now, there's a battle going on, right? We're meant to focus on outcomes, but here I am talking about outputs. And I was talking about this with a coach in a bank the other day, and she like looked around and she said, "Are we even allowed to say output? You know, like, we're meant to be focused on outcomes." So let me just spend a bit of time establishing the relationship between outcomes and outputs. So when you talk to Chatty G about this, about, you know, people being outcome focused, this is the answer you get. An outcome refers to the ultimate impact or end result that a project, initiative, or team effort is aiming to achieve. That makes sense. And then it goes on to say, well, that's it. Outcome, the ultimate impact or end result. And then it goes on to say that an outcome can be distinguished from an output. Outputs are the tangible deliverables. So I tried that out in my head. Output, tangible deliverable. It's actually a very tangible deliverable is a very untangible concept. So I went to Scrum. This is the Scrum guide. The Scrum guide talks about increments. That's what Scrum teams deliver, according to the Scrum guide. They deliver increments. And an increment is a concrete stepping stone towards product goal, and each increment is additive to all prior increments, etc. So make me realize that an output is an increment of change to a system. So an outcome is the end result, and the output is the increment of change to the system that hopefully gets you to that end result. So here's a production line. It's actually a series of activities, right? At every stage in this production line, which is producing cars, there's an activity going on. And the end result of all of these activities in this workflow is an output, in this case, a car. And this output is an increment of change to a system. You know, the system is, in this case, the world, or you might think of it as the, you know, the kind of the bottom line for the company that's making the car. Somewhere when an output is produced, a system is being changed. And that system, that change to the system produces an outcome. Hopefully, in the case of cars, more sales. Yeah. But it could be less sales. It's very unpredictable. Yeah, we could get all sorts of outcomes that we actually don't want. For instance, more traffic, pollution, urban sprawl, global warming, melting ice, etc. So I don't know if people are familiar with this diagram, Canevin. It's a good way to think about the relationship between like complex, unpredictable situations and situations that are manageable, complicated, and clear situations. So outcomes live in this complex kind of zone, right? They're unpredictable. You can't really manage them. You get unpredictable ones. You don't get the ones you want all the time, and you get ones you don't want sometimes. Whereas outputs are manageable. Increments of change to a system are manageable. You can track how long they take to get done. You can measure how many of them will get done in a particular time. We can, you know, implement policies to improve the way they go through the system. And that's what Agile is all about. And activities are all over the place. So here's a fun quiz. I don't know if we can do this with voice. Can people actually talk, Jeff, or do we have to do it in chat?
Let me try. So not really, but apparently there's some presenter requests.
Yeah. All right.
So maybe we could. I don't know whether we can. I don't even know what that is. So oh no, sorry, that's for people requesting to be a presenter. Okay. Right. So do you want? Well, I guess we could have people requesting to be a presenter if they wanted to. As Kat's.
And we'll look at chat as well when we do this quiz. So this quiz is all about spotting outcomes, outputs, and activities. And it's in the context that the theme here is a park, like a playground, children's playground. So I'm going to play basically outcome, output, or activity. I'll jump over and have a look at chat. So first one, healthy, happy children. Outcome, output, or activity. Someone says outcome. 1 vote for outcome, 2 votes for outcome. Yeah, exactly. That's an outcome. That's what we want. Slippery dip. Outcome, output, or activity. Activity, interesting. Output, activity, activity, interesting. In the context of making a park, of making a playground, the slippery dip is an output. In the context of building a playground, a slippery dip is an output, just like making a car on a production line. At least that's what I think. What about a plan? No, Kat, you have to get off the fence and pick one. Very good. I reckon everybody has nailed it. It's an activity. Yes. So I was deliberately confusing because I gave it a name like a noun, right? I said it's a plan. So it sounds like an output, but you weren't fooled. You know that it's really planning, right? The planning stage of a workflow. What about a set of swings? Output, outcome, activity. Output, output, yes. Output, exactly. A design. Interesting. Activity. This is a very smart group. Activity. Engineer sign off. Outcome, output, or activity. Activity. Yes. Activity. That's right. You might have a column on your board for like approval. Monkey bars. Outcome, output, or activity. Output. Exactly. And build. Output. Ooh, activity. Yeah, activity. So we're building. Even though I made it sound like an output, the build. Merry-go-round. Outcome, output, or activity. Output. Yes. Very good. All right. You might not agree with me about all of those things, but I think roughly we're all on the same page, which is fantastic. So it's safe to move on. Okay, so this is a model of a Jira board with sticky notes. It's a bit easier than looking at a board, but basically it's just our Jira board, right? From left to right, to do, and then a bunch of columns for activity stages, and then a done stage. So what happens is that our outputs move along the activity state, along the workflow, through the activity stages of the workflow, and they get done. That's the increment of change to the system getting done, right? And then hopefully we get the outcome we want from that. Sometimes you need more than one output to get an outcome. You have a few goes, or you do it kind of incrementally or iteratively. It's fun. All right, so this is an example from my own kind of way of organizing my own work, because I use Jira to organize my own work. And also there's a small team of coaches working in this kind of area of this company. And when we first started using Jira, we made a bunch of Jira tickets. Like this was our workflow, right? It's very simple. It's just to do, we haven't started yet. Doing, we're doing it. And then done, it's done. And that makes sense for us because we don't have anyone to hand off to. Like we just try stuff out and then it's over, it's done with. And so we made a bunch of Jira tickets for the things we were planning to do. And I have a one-on-one with my boss. And so, you know, every month or so. So in the first month, I did some prep work. We did some prep work, and then we started coaching. And we had like a few teams. So then we're coaching the teams, and then we did a workshop on, you know, establishing work in progress limits. And then I had my one-on-one with my boss, and I said, "Oh, I did some prep work, and then we did some. Well, we started some coaching, and that's just going to go on for as long as it goes on, and then we did a workshop." And it wasn't a very compelling story. Like I couldn't really connect up the the things I was doing, the work I was doing, with the outcomes that we want as a kind of coaching chapter. And so we started thinking of what we do as outputs, end-to-end outputs for us as a small coaching team. So this prep work turned into an actual increment of change. Like we actually had a dozen squads. Across all these squads, what we really want is to make sure that every team has a Jira board. So that became our increment of change. And we did that. And at the end of that first kind of quarter, every team had a Jira board that reflected their workflow. And then we did a workshop, and then we started doing this focus on, this particular kind of uplift with these squads. We're trying to get kind of most or all of the squads at least, a certain way across the line with having work in progress limits. And then I had a one-on-one with my boss. And I was able to say, okay, this is what we've achieved. Every team has a board. We've done a WIP limits workshop. So now everyone knows about WIP limits. That's an increment of learning. And this team A, has WIP limits. The others are still, coming along. So by thinking of our work as a series of outputs for the team, it totally changed the way we use Jira. Now Jira is like indispensable to us. It is our coaching plan. Like we don't do any other coaching plan except set up all these outputs for the quarter and work through them week by week. Any questions before I go on?
Sorry, Kylan, just took myself off mute. There was no questions that have come through. No.
Good. All right. So the constraint we only care about team outputs makes agile work properly. You might be using a board, and you might be using, agile stuff like stand-ups and all that sort of thing. If agile is what you're after, if the benefits of agile is what you're after, then it's absolutely critical that you focus only on these team outputs. So here's the Agile Manifesto up online. One of the principles of the Agile Manifesto is working software is the primary measure of progress. And now, if you think about that, it doesn't mean working software that never changes. It means working software that is being worked on over time. And so what it really means is increments of change being delivered into working software. That's the measure of progress. Increments of change to a system. So it's baked in. Now, have you ever seen a Jira board that has these kind of tickets? If you have, it might be familiar. What I'm going to ask is, how many outputs are there on this board? Yeah.
We have an answer of 3.
Yeah. There's 3 outputs, but it's a little bit confusing, right? Because there's a lot of tickets on that board. There's a lot of issues on that board. There's an issue for design for output 1, an issue for dev for output 1, and an issue for design for output 2, and so on. Yeah. So the output is actually broken up across a whole lot of issues. What that means is that you never quite know, unless you're a genius, you never quite know, well, basically, honestly, if you've got more than 3 things on your board or, in your sprint, you just won't know when the output has actually been delivered. You'll know when these activities are done, because these are actually activities. You've got basically Jira issues for activities instead of outputs in this pattern. This is the same board, but with the 3 outputs moving through those activity stages, of the workflow. So outputs move through design, dev, test, and then they get done. So that's what we're after. If we want agile.
So Connor,
yeah.
sorry, Connor, we've got a question here. Can we call each activity as a task within each output?
Yeah, for sure, you can. That's right. Let's get into how you might track that in Jira. But I mean, obviously, if there were subtasks on the story, that would make perfect sense, right? But also, you don't need subtasks if you've got a column. You're doubling up, right? Because then what happens is your output story moves into test, say, and then what, you've got a checklist, or sorry, you've got a subtask for test as well. It sort of doesn't make any sense. You may as well just use the columns. But yeah, you could have subtasks for a whole bunch of things like code review, you know, do this, do that, connect with that system, write a unit test, all that sort of stuff. So what's really going on when you've got a board that's like to do, in progress, done, unless you're an agile coach who has an incredibly simple workflow. If you're a software development team, what's really going on is that you've got a board for every person on your team. Because let's say you've got a team of 3 people, a designer, like a solution designer, say, a developer, like an engineer, and a tester. What's happening is that they're looking at the same board, but really they're looking at different boards overlaid on top of each other. So the designer is looking at this board. This is her workflow. And the engineer, the developer, is looking at this board. And the tester is looking at this board. And so you've lost the ability that Agile really gives you to optimize as a team. And instead, you're just a bunch of individuals using a board. You're like me at home using a Kanban board to like manage my gardening stuff or whatever. There's no Agile going on because Agile is a technology for optimizing teams. So you got to have a workflow that represents, you got to have a columns on your board that represent your actual workflow. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with flow metrics, or you might think of them as Kanban metrics, like flow time, which is lead time, cycle time that I talked about before. Is anyone familiar with those?
So no one's volunteering, but yeah, so to some extent.
Okay, to some extent, great. So the metaphor that we use for flow metrics, which are brilliant, like these are replacing sprint metrics all over the place. Like, you know, there's a large bank you might have heard of, and it's all flow metrics, no sprint metrics, no story point velocity, none of that. These come from Kanban, but they're being used with Scrum teams, for example. So what you got here is a metaphor of flow. So work or work items, things that represent value, are flowing through the Jira board. This is not a Jira board, but could be. And so you got this concept of upstream. The work that's coming in is coming from upstream. So there are teams who are upstream with us. Yeah. And then you've got downstream as well. We hand off sometimes to other teams. We might do some software development work and then hand off to another team for deployment. Or we might even do deployment but hand off to a change management team for embedding and, you know, that sort of stuff. So there's always, or often, excuse me, downstream people as well as upstream people. And so the time it takes an output to get from the first in progress column on your Jira board to done, so the last column on your board usually, is called lead time. Yeah, or flow time, or sometimes cycle time. It depends how you define those things. That's a really amazing metric. That's the answer to the question, how long will it take? Like if you're actually tracking and averaging out your lead time over sprints, and somebody comes up and says, here's a new feature, how long will it take? You look at your lead time and you say, well, it could take between 1 week and 3 weeks. And for them, that might be a great answer. Or they might want a better answer, like it takes us exactly 1 week. So getting good with your lead time measurement is the secret to being seen as a really good team by your customers, the people, all your stakeholders. Throughput is the number of outputs that are done in a time period. It's also called flow velocity, as opposed to story point velocity, or sometimes just velocity. And then you've got work in progress as well. These are the kind of three core flow metrics. The number of outputs that are in progress during a time period. Yep.
So Conan, I might ask you a question of my own. So from this point of view, you've got, obviously there's different complexity to the actual outputs that go through. So do you see some sort of sizing still in regards to this to help with those metrics, or?
No, weirdly, you don't, because what happens when you do sizing, like let's say you put story points on things and you do all sorts of maths with story points instead of this stuff, instead of just counting outputs, what happens is you end up making big things look more valuable. And this does the opposite. If you don't pay attention to size, then what happens is it puts some kind of like evolutionary pressure on the system, on the team, to get smaller stories or smaller initiatives, wherever you measure it in Jira.
You're trying to make it small enough to get done. I mean, I do that with my kids, right? I break down. So I try to make the activity, or the, rather than saying clean entire house, vacuum room, or whatever.
Exactly. Small increment of change you can actually get done.
They get lots of ticks.
If you're being on ticks, like maybe, you get to go somewhere nice for a hamburger or whatever. If you get enough ticks, you want to make those things you have to do to get those ticks as small as possible. And it turns out that when we know that any production system is exponentially more productive when it has a bunch of small things going through it, as opposed to a small number of big things going through it, because it reduces the wait time and all the dependencies and all the problems and risk that happen with big things. So we want lots of small things going through the system exponentially faster. So these metrics when you try to gain these metrics, as long as you are working with outputs, that's the key constraint. When you try to gain these metrics, everything is an improvement. Everything improves the team. When you don't focus on constraints, when you do this, when you have a bunch of activities and you start trying to apply flow metrics to it, it totally doesn't work. Like, you don't get any metrics because you're not measuring the outputs. You're just measuring activities. This gives you flow metrics. So if you're in a place where you are using flow metrics, you may have recognized them as I was describing them by their many different names. If you are using them and you're not using end-to-end outputs, then what are you measuring? That's the question. If you're not using them and you want to use them, the question is, can we get value out of them yet? And if you're not using end-to-end outputs, that's the first thing you need to do. It's always the first thing I do when I go into a new engagement. This is also bad, right? You've got good end-to-end outputs. You've got 3 stories going across there. Let's say those outputs are stories. You've got 3 stories going across, and you've got another story for the deployment part of the first output, because what we decided was that once things are tested, they're done. And then there's a bunch of downstream work that we're not including in our workflow. Yeah, but we want to be able to talk about it in stand-up because somebody's spending all their time doing it. So we bring that downstream work back into the team and we plop it into the board as a deployment activity for a previous output. You can't do that. It's not an output. Your outputs, you've decided, go from design through test to done. That's it. You only get one shot. You can't double dip. If we start, this is a pattern I see all the time. So I say you because I'm always talking to squads who are doing this. So if you count these things as outputs, your metrics are messed up. Also, none of your agile stuff applies to this stuff, like this downstream work that appears on your board. Here's the opposite. This is upstream work. So this is from a team of, architects or something, upstream. They're in our squad. Maybe they're BAs. A lot of squads have BAs in large organizations, business analysts, and they do a lot of analysis. They do a lot of really good planning and solutionizing, so that when things come to the team, they're ready and the team can start doing it. But they're in the team, and so they like to have something on the board. This is the board, so they put their analysis work on the board. But what's really happening is they're doing analysis on something that hasn't yet hit the team. So often they're doing analysis on a whole epic's worth of stuff, or even a bigger chunk of stuff. They might be even thinking in terms of a release or something. So they've got like an analysis work for the next release or something like that. Who knows? It's not an output for the team. So what do you do? Well, here's another one. Sorry. Another bad kind of situation. A team has to devote a certain amount of its capacity to support throughout the sprint. So they go, okay, well, we need a support ticket this sprint. They'll put a support ticket in the sprint, goes into dev at the first day of the sprint, stays in dev the entire time. At the end of the sprint, we move it out. That's not actually an output. It's not an increment of change by itself. Each support request might be, if you wanted to track that, but just having something open for the whole sprint for support is not an output. And this is a ticket for me. This is somebody put a story on this board for me because I'm away on leave. And so my capacity is used up. And so what's happening is we're using the board here instead of for managing end-to-end outputs for speed and predictability of delivery of value. What we're doing is we're trying to manage our capacity using the board. So we're trying to capture and show where our capacity is going, not an output. So the trick is to use Jira to make a very clear distinction. You can't stop people doing this stuff, right? You can't stop people putting this stuff on the board. You're just going to be the weirdo who says, he's trying to lay down all these rules. But what you can do is you can say, look, we are only tracking end-to-end outputs. We only want, say, stories. All our stories have to be end-to-end outputs, but our tasks, you can make a task for whatever you want. You start to use the issue types in Jira to give us clarity about what we need to track and what we don't need to track. And we instantly can see where we can configure our flow metrics to ignore tasks. That's purple ones here. I should have used the Jira color coding. And so our flow metrics are good because all those non-outputs are ignored. We also don't have to worry about them in stand-up and all that sort of stuff. If people want to talk about it, that's fine. But if they don't want to talk about it and they don't want to put, maybe we're using story points or something for our stories, do that on your stories, but don't bother with tasks. You don't have to do any of that stuff on non-outputs. I'm amazed that people aren't arguing with me, but if they are, Jeff, let me know.
All right, no one's there yet, but look, we can bring up some different points of views or counter arguments, but let's keep going. And if anyone, Colin's interested in the chat, people, so feel free to raise it, and I'll take you off mute and get you into presenter.
I'm going to be deliberately, a bit antagonistic here. I'm going to say if you don't support your teams by setting this we only care about team outputs as a hard constraint, then you're making Agile unavailable for your teams. And you're also making flow metrics unavailable if you're not already using them, or if you are using them, you're making them pointless. They have no value if you're mixing your outputs with non-outputs, or if you just have non-outputs. So I'm actually going to finish pretty soon. Is that okay, Jeff?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
But
Good.
I will say, Conan, that we've only had one person leave.
Okay.
So you've
Well,
still got an audience here of 15 people. So
okay.
people are still here. Yeah.
All right, good, good. Well, this is kind of the last slide. It just goes on for a while, but you know, I would love to talk about particular situations that are happening for you, and you know, particular situations that might make what I've said, you know, wrong or impossible. That would be great. But here are the kind of steps that I recommend. Um, this is a very uncoachy thing to do. It's just basically say, look, this has worked for me, so it's got to work for you. But this is what I recommend to other coaches and other people, managers who are working with teams. Withhold coaching or teaching about anything other than the importance of team outputs until the team has end-to-end team outputs. Like, there's no point talking about stand-up, story points, estimation, you know, looking at flow metrics, doing any of that stuff. You can do it, it's great, but it's not delivering you any of that agile value. Teach about team outputs and coach for overcoming the obstacles that are hindering them, because there's always a reason why, you know, we haven't got outputs on the board. You know, usually it's because somebody said a sprint has to be 2 weeks long, and it literally takes us, like, I don't know, can take months to get an actual output right through the workflow of the team into production. So we want to seem like we're getting stuff done, so we break up our work into activities. So there's a lot of real obstacles, genuine reasons why people aren't doing it already. So work on that as a manager or as a coach or as a team member. And help the teams to update their boards to reflect the actual activities of their workflow as they understand them. So if they've got a board that's like to do, doing, done, to do, in progress, done, you know, or maybe, you know, maybe they got one extra column to do, in progress, blocked, done, you know, something that isn't really part of their workflow, like blocked, you know, help them to move to a situation where the board represents their workflow as they understand their workflow. I can tell you that the first time I do this with a team, it's never how I understand their workflow from looking at what they're doing. They always have some slightly different idea of what their workflow is. The point is that it's whatever they think their workflow is, that's what that's what the columns on the board should reflect. And then support the people to loosen the everything must get done in a sprint constraint. That's, you know, if they're doing Scrum or some kind of Scrum-like concoction, then that's often the reason why we feel like we can't get everything done in sprint. It's often the reason why we end up working with non-outputs. You know, like we might get stuff done almost in a sprint and then we close it and open a new one for the rest of the stuff in the next sprint to make our sprint metrics look good. We've got to let go of that. Let people put whatever they want on their board, as long as anything that isn't a team output is transparently easy to ignore completely. So you may have a policy, stories are outputs, tasks aren't. Or you might say only stories, or anything on the board, even, you know, stories, tasks, whatever other types you've got in Jira, they've all got to be outputs, but you can have subtasks for whatever you like. Something like that. But usually I find that stories, tasks is the easiest thing to, you know, to kind of, for people to get behind. And configure the flow metrics if you're using them to ignore everything that is in the team output. And withhold your endorsement of the team's flow metrics, you know, or any other metric, I guess, you know, sprint metrics, until they have 100% output. You know, don't kind of buy into this kind of like theater of looking at metrics that are measuring activities. Just say, well, you know, we'll pay attention to these metrics when we've got outputs. And it's nice if teams are sharing their metrics, then you can kind of say, okay, well, you know, these teams have got metrics, but these teams don't. And put some pressure on the teams, gentle pressure on the teams to kind of, get to output so they can have some metrics. And each day, this is a weird one, check every new Jira ticket and follow up openly with people, like in chat, like in a group chat, if something that isn't being ignored looks like it isn't an output. It's okay to have things that aren't outputs as long as they're being ignored. But if something's a story and we know that stories should be outputs, then it's not an output. Like it says, test that thing we did last sprint or something like that. You can always tell pretty much from the name. Follow up with people. Say, hey, this doesn't look like an end-to-end output. What's going on? Can we make it a subtask? Can we make it a task? Whatever. Now, we've got, I think we've got 12 teams. You can imagine what happens at a new sprint, like lead up to a new sprint, people are making a lot of things. We've got dashboards set up to catch all new stories that get created across all those teams. And we follow up on every single one. And we flag it. We say, yeah, this is an end-to-end output. It's that important for us. And also gamify it. Make a leaderboard. Praise the teams who get 100% team outputs. Even though when you start doing this, they won't even know what it is. At the end, when they get 100% team outputs, they're going to just think they're great. Like they're going to think they've really made a difference, and they actually have. It's the best thing they can do. That's what I've done, and it's worked for me. So maybe some of these will work for you.
Thank you, Kynan. Is that the end of your presentation side of things? So open up to questions, or?
Yeah, that's right. I'll go to my end of the presentation screen, which is me. But yeah, open for questions.
Great. So from Shriram, apologies if I'm not getting that right, which I'm probably not. We only have stories and tasks and have a definition of ready for each story. Story review considered for a sprint only when the definition of ready is met for the story, thus reducing or removing the lead time. Thoughts on this?
Yeah,
sounds like the BA work, right?
Yeah,
some of the
great
BA
strategy. Delay starting. That's the delay starting as long as possible strategy, and it's excellent. It encourages you to do good planning and good thinking. So we've got a bunch of, whatever our criteria are, there might be, we need a subtask for everything we think is going to be necessary to get this story done. It's got a design, it's got this, it's got that. Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant. You can only do it on real outputs, right? How can you get your definition of ready done for a activity like, the testing work for the last output? You couldn't. It wouldn't make sense. Your definition of ready probably doesn't apply. So your definition of ready then is a fantastic filter as well. If you can't do all the things on your definition of ready for something, maybe it's not an output. Yeah, that's a great strategy.
So I might just do a follow-up then, Kynan. So metrics really good in regards to on the board and looking at the outputs. But if we want to look at and go, we've got this great big brand new initiative, which isn't necessarily small increments, small changes. So something brand new or new business case for a new activity, that sort of metrics is quite different, right? Because that's not small, that's going to have a lot of, before that's approved, you're going to need governance approvals and what have you, a lot of analysis beforehand. So I guess when we're talking about metrics, you're not talking about this is the bee's knees and only metric that we should look at. This is for creation of these outputs.
Is that a Dorothy Dixer, Jeff? Because
I don't know, mate. Because it was a question, and you know what? I know lots of people don't know what a Dorothy Dixer is, so I've quite often mentioned it.
Throw it in to get an answer. So to get the answer that I want to give, and the answer I want to give is they are exactly the same metrics at those higher levels. You're just measuring different things. So you could imagine that initiative, which is starting up, lives on a board somewhere. And in fact, we have Jira boards for initiatives. And those initiatives go through a workflow, which is to do, ideation, discovery, in progress, in production embedding, and then done. And we have flow metrics to measure how long an initiative takes to get through the active stages of that workflow. We have definitions of ready for our initiatives, which include, it's got a business case, etc., blah, blah, blah. Throughput for initiatives, very important if you're going into a quarterly planning phase or a yearly planning thing. You want to know how many initiatives should we have in play this year? Well, look at how many initiatives were in play last year and make a call about whether that was too many or not. Turn it down. That's work in progress. That's your work in progress limit.
So with that sort of stuff, do you also have how many of the initiatives get killed? Or should we say laid to rest?
Yeah.
Or
in Canberra we say abandoned. Yeah. So it's great. Obviously you want to maximize the work not done. So at certain points, like before your commitment point, wherever that is on your board initiative, you want a lot of those initiatives not to make it to that point. You want to abandon them because you've done due diligence on that and enough research to understand that it probably might not deliver the value you expect it to, and it goes away. So yeah, if you want to measure how many of those, what's your ratio of like abandoned to things that get through, that's a great metric. Not a bad thing. You might want to turn it up, right? Have more abandons.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could even, so prior to this, I was in a conversation in a workshop around sales and marketing. And I was like, oh, well, we want so many to go through this. It's like, no, I want to band it. I want ones which aren't a good fit for us to know and not waste time on them. It's not about hitting that target. It's about hitting the right bit through the greatest value. So anyway, so it works in lots of different contexts, I guess.
Yeah, and they all should be increments. They all should be end-to-end outputs for whatever team.
Yeah.
So an initiative, of course, is an end-to-end output for the portfolio team, right? That level of the organization can be thought of as a team. And if you have an initiative, we have a lot of initiatives I'm currently grappling with. We have initiatives which are that thing we did last year, but we're doing it again some more. It's like, what is the increment? When will it be done? How would we know if we were going to abandon it? Like, how would we abandon it? You couldn't abandon it. Couldn't even tell when it's done, let alone abandon it. So yeah, everything's an output, even initiatives, and even the epics that contribute to those initiatives, and even the stories, not the subtasks. Yes. That's a good point. You get free reign on subtasks. Yep.
So I'm just going to put a call out there for any further questions. Just put it in the chat, and if you'd like to, I can make you a presenter if you'd like to ask a question. So far, no one's raised any more, Kynan. So do you have any final words?
No, that's about it. I think that's it. I think I pretty much covered everything. The thing I usually forget to say is subtasks. And maybe I should add that, but I managed to get those in at the end. Yeah, subtasks are free reign. You don't have to worry about them being outputs because they're below your flow metrics. It's actually kind of a really nice escape hatch to have, because otherwise, you just it's too constrained. You've got to have that escape hatch.
Yeah, you can do it. That's fine as long as it's this way. That's great. So thank you. So Mark Adams has just said that's inspiring talk. Thank you, Kynan. He's also thanked me as well, who did nothing but ask a couple of questions. So thanks everyone. Really appreciate it. Thanks Kat as well, was thankful for the chat, and others. We'll make this available to people. Thanks again, Kynan.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks everyone.